Hello, this is the CER retake guide for the test, the CER test, PS2 Learning Set 3, the mini CER, so you didn't have a full-fledged CER. Full-fledged CER is you probably would have written a page, maybe two. And this is the one on substance. So this is actually the retake for the evidence portion of it. So if you have to retake this portion of the test, it probably means that you got, well, it does mean that you got the evidence wrong, but there's a very good chance that you got the claim right. Very few people got the claim wrong. So what we're going to do is we're going to review what makes for good evidence, and we're going to review the data a little bit, and hopefully you can retake just this part of the test if that's all you need, and you can get to the point where you're proficient in all three parts, so you don't have to retake the test anymore, or retake CER tests anymore. So for evidence, make sure you have sufficient data. And I would say about a third of the people who took the test, they were headed down the right road. They were getting things correct. They just didn't have sufficient data. They did not use enough evidence to support the claim. Make sure it's appropriate. Use data that supports your claim. Leave out information that doesn't support the claim. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we go through the evidence. And make sure you have both qualitative and quantitative data. In other words, the quantitative one is what some people were missing. You just didn't have any numbers, or you had very few numbers. So when we look at the claim, or when we look at the sentence you're supposed to answer, is the type of substance used a factor in determining the amount of chemical energy that is converted when it's mixed with cupric chloride solution? And so it wants to know about the type of substance. So the very first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to look at the data. You're going to have to look at the evidence that you have. And you're going to have to figure out, is evidence, or is there evidence to support the fact that type of substance is a factor or maybe not a factor? So let's look at our evidence. So let me pull out a highlighter. So we know in experiment 1, we use 0.5 grams of aluminum. In experiment 2, we use 0.75 grams of aluminum. And in experiment 3, we use 0.5 grams of steel wool. So we did a practice test earlier in this unit. And we talked about how is mass a factor. And when we did that, we figured out that we wanted to use the same substance. If we're going to change the mass, we want to make sure the substance is the same. Otherwise, we can't compare it. So when we look at this data, what would we use for the type of substance? Well, here it's aluminum, and here it's steel wool. So now we have it narrowed down. These two are aluminum, this one is steel wool. So what are we going to compare? Are we going to compare experiment 2 to experiment 3? Or are we going to compare experiment 1 to experiment 3? Well, this is where we have to go back to the factors. We only want the type of substance. So again, if we look at this, here it's 0.5 grams, 0.75 grams. But did you notice that this is only 0.5 grams? So we cannot use experiment number 2 to compare. Because if this did change, and we know that it did, why did it change? Did it change because we had more mass? Or did it change because we had different substances? So that alone should tell us that we have to cross this out. We have to use this one right here, and we have to use this one right here. So what do you write now? You have to use the evidence. Well, just use the evidence that's there. How could we talk about this? What could you say? Well, you could simply say something like, well, when we use 0.5 grams of aluminum, the temperature changed from 21.6 degrees Celsius to 54.3 degrees Celsius for a total temperature change of 32.7 degrees Celsius. And the 32.7 may say 32.5 on your paper, but that was a mistake on our part. It really is 32.7. So did you notice how I just read this and I stated we started here, then we went to here, and then we went to here? Now, what do we have? Well, that's one piece of evidence. Then we have the second piece of evidence. When we use 0.5 grams of steel wool, now did you see what I did? Up here I said 0.5 grams, and I said 0.5 grams here. So now the reader, which is me, the grader, the teacher who's grading your paper, now I know the masses are the same, and we're only going to change aluminum to steel wool. So when I use 0.5 grams of steel wool, the temperature went from 21.4 degrees Celsius to 25.4 degrees Celsius for a total change of only 4 degrees Celsius. So that's a very good start. But there's one more key piece of evidence you have to have. So what does this mean? And what I mean by what does this mean? If we look at our data, we notice that this is 32.7 and this is 4. So somewhere in your evidence, or if you sneak it into your reasoning, I'll find it there too. But somewhere you need to say your third piece of evidence is that when you use aluminum foil, the temperature changed 32.7 degrees Celsius when you compared it to steel wool only changing 4 degrees Celsius. And you can even subtract them. And if you subtract them, if you just take 32.7, plug it into a calculator, you can use your Chromebook, and you minus 4, it's a 28.7 degree change. So you might say in your evidence that there is a 28.7 degree difference when we used aluminum foil versus steel wool. Or you might say when we used aluminum foil versus steel wool, the amount of thermal energy dropped by 28.7 degrees Celsius. So there's different ways you can say it. So make sure in your evidence you have all these numbers, you have these numbers, but then you also have to compare these numbers. Now, if you have any questions, please be sure to ask. I can try and explain stuff to you, but what I'd like you to do now is use your pieces of information, and don't use this one right here because this is the one you don't want to use. But what I'd like you to do is rewrite your evidence, and then I will regrade your paper, and if you earn a proficient, I will change your score. Thanks.